I never thought my own sister would try to murder my child. But as I watched my 6-month-old daughter convulsing in my arms at what was supposed to be the happiest day of our family's life, I realized that the person I trusted most had just destroyed everything. My husband was halfway across the world commanding troops, my father was celebrating his dream retirement, and I was completely alone, watching my baby fight for her life because of a glass of apple juice my sister had handed me with a smile. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of Dad's retirement ceremony started like any other Saturday in our suburban Phoenix home. Marcus had been deployed to Eastern Europe for 3 months, running classified operations I couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. As a 2-star general at the Pentagon, he'd warned me this deployment would be different, longer, more dangerous, and with virtually no communication windows. Our daughter Lily had been born just 2 weeks before he left, and now at 6 months old, she barely knew her father's voice. I was struggling with the morning routine when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister Rachel. "Can't wait for today. Dad's gonna cry when they present him with that plaque." She was right. After 35 years as chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Pentagon General, Dr. William Hartwell was finally hanging up his scrubs. The hospital was throwing him a massive retirement party at the Marriott downtown, complete with colleagues flying in from across the country, and a presentation ceremony that would make him the guest of honor he'd always deserved to be. Rachel had been Dad's golden child since medical school. While I'd chosen to marry Marcus and focus on raising Lily, she'd followed directly in Dad's footsteps, becoming an anesthesiologist at the same hospital. She was brilliant, driven, and had never made a mistake in her professional life, which is exactly why what happened next was so perfectly calculated. The retirement party was everything Dad had dreamed of. The hotel ballroom was packed with surgeons, nurses, administrators, and family friends who'd watched him save thousands of lives over the decades. Mom had flown in from her new life in Florida, putting aside their bitter divorce to celebrate this milestone. Even Marcus's parents drove up from Tucson, despite barely knowing my family. Lily was being an angel, sleeping peacefully in her carrier while I mingled with Dad's colleagues. Everyone wanted to meet the general's wife and coo over the baby. I felt proud wearing my navy dress, the one Marcus had bought me before deployment, trying to represent our military family with dignity even though I felt like I was drowning most days as a single mother. Rachel appeared at my elbow during the cocktail hour, looking stunning as always in her emerald green dress that perfectly matched her eyes. She'd always been the prettier sister, the smarter sister, the one who never seemed to struggle with anything life threw at her. "You look exhausted, Sarah," she said, her voice full of what sounded like genuine concern. "When's the last time you got a full night's sleep?" I laughed, but it came out hollow. "Sleep? What's that? Lily's been going through a growth spurt. She's up every 2 hours wanting to eat." I shifted her carrier to my other arm, feeling the familiar ache in my shoulders from constantly holding her. "Here, let me help." Rachel reached for the carrier, and I gratefully let her take some of the weight. "You know what? I brought something for you. Mom's old secret weapon." She pulled a small glass baby bottle from her purse, filled with what looked like diluted apple juice. "Remember how she used to give us this when we were teething? It's just a tiny bit of apple juice mixed with water. It'll help Lily sleep better, and you'll actually get some rest tonight." I hesitated. Lily was exclusively breastfed, and our pediatrician had been very clear about not introducing anything else until at least 8 months. But Rachel was a doctor. She'd specialized in anesthesiology, which meant she understood medications and dosages better than almost anyone, and I was so desperately tired that the promise of a full night's sleep felt like a lifeline. "Are you sure it's safe?" Dr. Peterson said no juice until... Sarah. Rachel's voice took on that professional tone she used when explaining medical procedures to worried families. "I'm a physician. I've been working with pediatric cases for years. This is literally what our mother gave us as babies, and we turned out fine. It's just a few ounces of heavily diluted apple juice. Trust me." The word trust hit me like a physical weight. Rachel had never steered me wrong. When I was applying to colleges, she'd helped me write essays. When I was dating Marcus, she'd been the one to encourage me to say yes to his proposal. When I'd struggled with postpartum depression after Lily's birth, she'd driven over every day with groceries and help. She was my big sister, my role model, and one of the few people in my life I trusted completely. Dad's speech was starting, and the room was gathering around the podium. I could see him adjusting his tie nervously, the same gesture he'd made before every important surgery of his career. This was his moment, and I didn't want to miss it by debating baby feeding schedules. "Okay," I said, taking the bottle from Rachel, "just this once. But if she gets an upset stomach, you're explaining it to Marcus when he calls." Rachel smiled, that warm, confident smile that had always made me feel safe. "She'll be fine. Better than fine. You both need this." Lily had been fussing slightly, making those pre-cry sounds that meant she was getting hungry. The timing seemed perfect. I settled into a chair near the back of the room where I could feed her without disturbing Dad's speech, and offered her the bottle. She latched on immediately, her tiny hands wrapping around the glass as she drank. Dad was talking about his first day at the hospital, how nervous he'd been walking into that operating room for the first time. The audience was laughing at his self-deprecating jokes, and I could see tears in his eyes as he looked out at all the lives he'd touched. This was exactly the send-off he deserved. Lily finished about half the bottle and seemed content, so I set it aside and lifted her to my shoulder for burping. She felt warm and relaxed against me, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to sleep for 6 straight hours. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe I'd been overthinking everything, letting anxiety and exhaustion cloud my judgment about what was best for my daughter. Dad was wrapping up his speech, thanking Mom despite their divorce, acknowledging his colleagues, and mentioning how proud he was of both his daughters. "Rachel followed in my footsteps and became an even better doctor than I ever was," he said, and I saw my sister beam with pride. "And Sarah chose a different path, marrying a true American hero and raising what I know will be the next generation of strong, capable women." The room erupted in applause, and I felt a surge of love for my family. This was what mattered. This connection, this support system, this network of people who cared about each other. Marcus might be thousands of miles away, but I wasn't really alone. I had Dad, I had Rachel, I had this community. That's when Lily started making a sound I'd never heard before. It wasn't crying. It wasn't the normal fussing or gurgling that babies make. It was a high-pitched, desperate wheeze, like she couldn't catch her breath. I pulled her away from my shoulder and looked at her face. Her lips were turning blue. "Rachel," I whispered urgently, but the applause was still going, and she couldn't hear me over the noise. Lily's tiny body went rigid in my arms, and then she started convulsing. Everything after that happened in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. I was screaming my sister's name, stumbling toward the front of the room where she stood applauding Dad. The bottle fell from my lap and shattered on the marble floor, apple juice and glass spreading in a pattern that would be burned into my memory forever. Rachel turned, saw what was happening, and her face went completely white. But it wasn't the shock of seeing a medical emergency. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like guilt. Rachel was beside me in seconds, her medical training kicking in as she took Lily from my arms. But instead of the calm, professional demeanor I'd seen her use in countless emergencies, her hands were shaking. She was muttering something under her breath, checking Lily's pulse, her breathing, her pupils. "Call 911, she barked at someone behind us, but her voice cracked on the words. The entire retirement party had gone silent, 200 guests frozen in horror as they watched a 6-month-old baby fight for her life in the middle of what should have been a celebration. Dad pushed through the crowd, his surgeon instincts overriding everything else. He took one look at Lily and immediately began coordinating with Rachel. "Pulse is rapid and thready," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Breathing is labored. What did she ingest?" "Apple juice," I gasped, pointing at the shattered bottle on the floor. Rachel gave her apple juice mixed with water. She said it was safe, that Mom used to give it to us. Something flickered across Dad's face, but he didn't have time to process it. The paramedics were already rushing through the ballroom doors, their equipment clattering against the marble floors. I watched them work on my daughter with a detached horror, like I was observing someone else's nightmare. They loaded Lily into the ambulance and I climbed in beside her. Rachel tried to follow, but one of the paramedics stopped her. Are you immediate family? I'm her aunt. I'm also a physician at Phoenix General. The paramedic looked between us, then at Lily's deteriorating condition. We need room to work. You can follow in your own vehicle. Quote, as the ambulance doors slammed shut, I caught a glimpse of Rachel standing on the sidewalk. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking like every other person at that party. She was staring at the ambulance with an expression I couldn't decipher, her phone pressed to her ear. The ride to Phoenix General was a blur of medical terminology I didn't understand. The paramedics were radiating a controlled urgency that told me everything I needed to know about how serious this was. One of them started an IV line in Lily's tiny arm, while the other monitored her vital signs and communicated with the hospital. Possible ingestion of unknown substance, I heard him say into his radio. 6-month-old female, presenting with seizure activity, respiratory distress, and cyanosis. ETA 4 minutes. Unknown substance. Not apple juice. The words sent ice through my veins. Dr. Amanda Chen was waiting when we arrived at the emergency room. She was Dad's protege, someone who'd trained under him for years and had become like a third daughter to our family. Her face was grim as she examined Lily, ordering a battery of tests with rapid-fire precision. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Sarah, I need you to tell me exactly what Lily consumed today, she said while the nurses worked around us. Everything, even things that seem insignificant. She's been exclusively breastfed, I said, my voice coming out in choppy fragments. No formula, no solid food, nothing. But tonight, Rachel gave her a bottle with apple juice and water. She said it was diluted, that it would help her sleep. Dr. Chen's hands stilled for just a moment. Rachel gave her apple juice? Tonight? Yes. Maybe 30 minutes before she started convulsing. Why? What's wrong with apple juice? Instead of answering, Dr. Chen turned to one of the nurses. I need a full tox screen, stat, and get me Rachel Hartwell on the phone, now. The next few hours passed in a haze of medical procedures and growing dread. They pumped Lily's stomach, ran blood tests, monitored her heart rate and breathing. Each test seemed to reveal something worse than the last. Her liver enzymes were elevated. Her blood showed signs of a toxic substance that nobody could immediately identify. Rachel arrived at the hospital around midnight, still wearing her emerald dress from the party, but looking disheveled and pale. She found me in the family waiting room, clutching a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Any updates? She asked, sitting down beside me. They're running more tests. Dr. Chen won't tell me anything specific, but I can see it in her face. It's bad, Rachel. Really bad. Rachel nodded, staring at her hands. I'm sure she'll be fine. Babies are more resilient than we think. Something about her tone felt wrong, too casual, too detached for someone whose niece was fighting for her life because of something she'd given her. Where did you get that apple juice? I asked. Rachel looked up, and for a split second I saw something flash in her eyes. Fear? Guilt? It was gone so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it. I made it myself. Just like Mom used to. Apple juice from the store, diluted with water. Which store? I don't remember. Probably Safeway. Why does it matter? It mattered because Dr. Chen had asked me the same question 3 times. It mattered because the nurses kept whispering to each other when they thought I couldn't hear. It mattered because my daughter was dying. And nobody could tell me why. Dad appeared in the doorway, still wearing his retirement party suit but with his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since his speech earlier that evening. How is she? He asked, but he was looking at Rachel, not me. Still critical, I said. They won't tell me much, but the tests keep showing toxicity levels that don't make sense for apple juice. Dad sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs. I spoke with Dr. Chen. She's concerned about the specific compound they're finding in Lily's bloodstream. It's not consistent with fruit juice. The room went very quiet. Rachel had gone completely still beside me. What kind of compound? I asked. Dad looked at Rachel again, and this time I caught the exchange. There was something passing between them, some kind of communication I wasn't part of. Dad, what kind of compound? It appears to be a pharmaceutical agent, something that would typically be used in medical settings. The words hit me like a physical blow. A pharmaceutical agent, something from a medical setting. Rachel worked in a medical setting. Rachel had access to drugs that could hurt a baby. Rachel had given Lily that bottle. I turned to look at my sister, really look at her, for the first time since this nightmare began. She was staring at the floor, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Rachel, I said quietly, what did you put in that bottle? She didn't answer. Rachel, my voice was getting louder, attracting attention from other families in the waiting room. What did you give my daughter? When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but underneath the tears was something else, something that looked almost like relief. I never meant for it to go this far, she whispered. Dad stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. Rachel, don't say another word. Not here. But it was too late. The confession was already written across her face, and I could see that Dr. Chen had appeared in the doorway, listening to every word. My sister, the person I'd trusted most in the world, had poisoned my baby. And whatever she'd used, whatever pharmaceutical agent she'd slipped into that innocent-looking bottle of apple juice, was slowly killing my daughter while my husband was half a world away, completely unaware that our family was falling apart. The question wasn't whether Rachel had done this intentionally. The question was why. Dr. Chen stepped fully into the waiting room, her expression carefully controlled. Mr. Hartwell, I need to speak with you and Rachel privately. Sarah, Lily is stable for now, but we need to discuss treatment options. I'm not going anywhere, I said, standing up. Whatever you need to discuss about my daughter, I'm hearing it. Dad looked like he wanted to argue, but Dr. Chen nodded. Conference room B, all of us. The walk down that hospital corridor felt endless. Rachel moved like she was sleepwalking, her earlier composure completely shattered. Dad kept glancing between us, and I realized he knew something, had known something all along. Conference room B was sterile and cold, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly. Dr. Chen closed the door and turned to face us, a manila folder in her hands. The toxicology results are back, she said without preamble. Lily was poisoned with propofol. The word hit the room like a bomb. Propofol. I'd heard of it before. The drug that had killed Michael Jackson. A powerful anesthetic that could stop someone's heart if administered incorrectly. That's impossible, I whispered. Rachel said it was apple juice. Dr. Chen opened the folder and pulled out a lab report. The apple juice masked the taste, but the concentration of propofol in Lily's system is consistent with what we'd use for pediatric surgery. Someone with medical knowledge calculated this dosage very precisely. I looked at Rachel, waiting for her to deny it, to explain how this could have happened. Instead, she slumped forward in her chair and started crying. I didn't mean to hurt her, she sobbed. I swear to God, Sarah, I never meant to hurt Lily. The room spun around me. You did this on purpose? You deliberately gave my baby propofol? It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. I calculated the dosage for her weight. It was just supposed to make her sleep deeply for a few hours so you could get some rest. So you could enjoy Dad's party without worrying about her. Dr. Chen's voice cut through Rachel's sobs like ice. Rachel, propofol isn't a sleep aid. It's a general anesthetic. Even in calculated doses, it can cause respiratory depression, cardiac arrest, and death in infants. You know this. I know, Rachel screamed, her composure finally breaking completely. I know what it can do. But I also know how to do it safely. I've administered propofol hundreds of times. I calculated everything perfectly. Dad had gone completely white. Rachel, what have you done? I was trying to help. She turned to me, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Sarah, you were falling apart. You hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a time in months. You were having panic attacks, crying all the time. I thought if Lily could sleep through the night just once, you could reset. You could start feeling human again. So you decided to drug my baby without telling me? I knew you'd say no. You've been so anxious about everything since Marcus deployed. You won't let anyone help you. You won't take the antidepressants Dr. Morrison prescribed. You won't even let Mom babysit for a few hours. I thought this was the only way to give you what you needed. The worst part was that she was right about my state of mind. I had been falling apart. The combination of postpartum depression, Marcus's deployment, and single motherhood had been crushing me slowly. But that didn't justify what she'd done. Dr. Chen was typing notes on her tablet. Rachel, I have to ask, where did you obtain the propofol? Rachel's crying stopped abruptly. She looked at Dad, then back at Dr. Chen. I can't answer that. You can't, or you won't? I won't. Dr. Chen set down her tablet and leaned forward. Rachel, a 6-month-old baby is fighting for her life because of a controlled substance that you administered without consent. The police are going to be involved whether you cooperate or not. Your best option is to tell us everything now. Police. The word sent a new wave of terror through me. This wasn't just a family crisis anymore. This was a crime. You stole it from the hospital, Dad said quietly. It wasn't a question. Rachel didn't deny it. How long has this been going on? Dr. Chen asked. The drug diversion, I mean. It's not what you think, Rachel said quickly. I haven't been selling it or using it recreationally. Sometimes I take small amounts for patients who need extra comfort during procedures. Patients who are suffering and the standard protocols aren't enough. Dr. Chen and Dad exchanged a look that told me this was worse than I'd imagined. Rachel wasn't just talking about taking propofol for Lily. She was talking about a pattern of unauthorized drug use that could have been going on for months or years. What patients? Dad asked, his voice deadly quiet. Terminal cases mostly. People in pain who were scheduled for procedures they were terrified of. I'd give them just a little extra to help them through it, to make their last weeks more bearable, without documenting it, without getting consent from the attending physicians. The attending physicians don't understand what those patients are going through. They see numbers on charts, not human beings who are scared and hurting. I realized I was listening to my sister describe how she'd been playing God with vulnerable patients for who knew how long. The sister I'd admired for her medical expertise had been breaking every ethical rule of her profession. How many patients, Rachel? Dr. Chen's voice was clinical now, like she was taking a deposition. I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 over the past 2 years. 20 or 30 instances of unauthorized drug administration. I was helping them. You were putting them at risk without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Chen stood up and walked to the door. I have to make some phone calls. Rachel, I strongly advise you to contact a lawyer before you say anything else to anyone. Sarah, Lily's condition has stabilized, but we're going to need to keep her under observation for at least 48 hours. The propofol is mostly out of her system, but we need to monitor for any delayed effects. After Dr. Chen left, the three of us sat in terrible silence. Dad looked like he'd aged another decade in the past hour. Rachel had stopped crying and was staring at the wall with an expression I'd never seen before. Defeated, hollow, completely empty. I tried to reach Marcus, I said finally. His commanding officer said they'd get a message to him, but it could be hours or days before he can call back. What are you going to tell him? Rachel asked. The question hung in the air like poison. What was I going to tell my husband? That his sister-in-law had drugged his daughter with stolen hospital medications? That the family he'd married into included someone capable of putting our baby's life at risk to prove a point about my mental health? I'm going to tell him the truth, I said, that my sister poisoned our daughter and nearly killed her. Rachel flinched like I'd slapped her. Sarah, please? I know what I did was wrong, but I never meant... Stop, I held up my hand. Just stop talking. Every word out of your mouth makes this worse. Dad finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel, I have to report this to the medical board. You understand that, right? Your medical license, your career, everything you've worked for, it's over. I know. And there will be criminal charges. Drug theft, child endangerment, possibly attempted murder, depending on how the prosecutor sees it. I know. Then why? Dad's voice broke on the question. Why would you throw away everything for a few hours of sleep for Sarah? Why would you risk Lily's life? Rachel looked at me then, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something real in her eyes. Not the medical professional, not the concerned sister, but the person underneath all of that. Because I was jealous, she whispered. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. None of us had expected that level of honesty. Jealous of what? I asked. Of everything. Your marriage, your baby, your life. You have Marcus, this incredible man who loves you unconditionally. You have Lily, this perfect little person who will always need you. You have purpose and meaning and a future that doesn't depend on cutting people open to feel important. I stared at my sister, trying to process what she was saying. I've spent my entire adult life in hospitals, she continued. I put people to sleep for a living, and then I go home to an empty apartment and put myself to sleep with wine and sleeping pills. I'm 34 years old, and the only thing I'm good at is making people unconscious. So you decided to make my baby unconscious too? I thought if I could fix your problem, if I could be the one who saved your marriage and your sanity, then maybe I'd matter to someone the way you matter to Marcus. The twisted logic of it was almost incomprehensible. Rachel had poisoned Lily not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to feel needed. She'd risked my daughter's life to prove she could be a hero. And now, instead of being anyone's hero, she was going to prison. 2 days later, I was sitting beside Lily's hospital crib when my phone finally rang with an international number, Marcus. After 48 hours of complete silence from the Pentagon, my husband was finally calling back. Sarah? Jesus Christ, I've been trying to get through for hours. They told me there was a family emergency but wouldn't give me details. Is everyone okay? I looked down at Lily, who was sleeping peacefully with an IV still taped to her tiny arm. How do you tell someone you love that their world has been turned upside down while they were thousands of miles away, unable to do anything about it? Lily's in the hospital, I said. She was poisoned. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought we'd lost connection. Poisoned how? By what? Sarah, talk to me. Rachel gave her propofol mixed with apple juice. She nearly died, Marcus. Another long pause. Rachel? Your sister Rachel? The doctor? She stole it from the hospital. She said she was trying to help me get some sleep, but she's been taking drugs from the pharmacy for months, maybe years. The police arrested her yesterday. I could hear Marcus breathing heavily on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely, from worried husband to military commander. I'm coming home. Marcus, you can't. You're in the middle of a deployment. The Pentagon won't. I'm a 2-star general, Sarah. My daughter was poisoned by someone we trusted. I'm coming home, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with the Joint Chiefs. After Marcus hung up, I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Having him home would mean I wasn't facing this nightmare alone anymore, but it also meant explaining things I wasn't sure I understood myself. Like why I'd trusted Rachel with Lily's safety when every parenting instinct should have told me not to give a 6-month-old anything besides breast milk. Detective Maria Santos arrived that afternoon to take my official statement. She was a small woman with graying hair and kind eyes, but there was steel underneath the gentleness that made me think she'd seen every terrible thing people could do to each other. I know this is difficult, she said, settling into the chair across from Lily's crib, but I need you to walk me through exactly what happened at your father's retirement party. I told her everything I could remember, from Rachel offering to help with Lily to the moment my daughter started convulsing. Detective Santos took notes without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification about timing or specific details. Has Rachel ever given Lily anything before? Medication, food, anything at all? No, Lily's been exclusively breastfed since birth. I've been very careful about that. And Rachel knew this? Yes. She's actually criticized me for being too rigid about it. She thought I was being overly anxious. Detective Santos looked up from her notepad. How would you describe your relationship with your sister before this incident? I had to think about that. Close, I thought. She was my role model growing up. She helped me through college, supported my marriage to Marcus, and was excited about becoming an aunt. But now I'm wondering if I ever really knew her at all. What do you mean? The things she said in the hospital conference room, about being jealous of my life, about feeling empty and purposeless. I had no idea she felt that way. We talked all the time, but apparently she was hiding a lot. Detective Santos nodded. Often the people closest to us are the best at concealing their true feelings. Rachel has admitted to taking propofol from the hospital pharmacy on multiple occasions. We're working with Phoenix General to audit their controlled substance inventory going back 2 years. The scope of Rachel's deception was still sinking in. This wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of poor judgment. It was a pattern of theft and reckless endangerment that had been going on right under everyone's noses. What happens to her now? I asked. She's been charged with aggravated assault, child endangerment, and theft of controlled substances. Depending on what we find in the pharmacy audit, there could be additional charges. She's looking at anywhere from 5 to 15 years in prison. 15 years. Rachel would be almost 50 when she got out. Her medical career permanently destroyed. Her life completely derailed because she'd wanted to prove she could fix my problems better than I could. Dad appeared in the doorway, looking hesitant about interrupting. Detective Santos gathered her things and stood to leave. "I'll be in touch if we need any additional information," she said. "In the meantime, Lily should make a full recovery. The propofol is completely out of her system and there don't appear to be any lasting effects." After the detective left, Dad sat down heavily in the chair she'd vacated. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. His retirement celebration now forever tainted by what had happened. "The hospital board met this morning," he said without preamble. "They're conducting a full investigation into Rachel's activities. Anyone who received unauthorized medication will be contacted and offered additional medical monitoring." "How many patients are we talking about?" "At least 30 that we know of so far. Maybe more." Quote, I closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what Rachel had done. 30 patients who'd been given unmonitored drugs by someone who thought she knew better than their attending physicians. 30 families who would now have to wonder if their loved one's care had been compromised. "There's something else," Dad continued. "The hospital is recommending that I undergo a psychological evaluation." "What? Why?" "Because Rachel was my protégé. Because I supervised her work for years and apparently missed signs of serious psychological instability and drug theft. The board wants to make sure I haven't been covering for her or exhibiting similar judgment problems." The injustice of it made me furious. Dad had dedicated his entire career to helping people, and now his reputation was being questioned because of Rachel's actions. "That's ridiculous. You had no way of knowing what she was doing." "Didn't I?" Dad looked at me with eyes full of doubt. "I knew she was struggling with loneliness and depression. I knew she'd been working excessive hours and seemed increasingly isolated. Maybe if I'd paid more attention, gotten her professional help instead of just assuming she'd work through it on her own." "Dad, you're not responsible for Rachel's choices. I'm responsible for the patients under my supervision. If Rachel was impaired or acting erratically and I missed it, then yes, I am responsible." Before I could argue further, there was a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, someone demanding to see me immediately. A moment later, Marcus strode through the door in his desert camouflage uniform, still carrying his deployment bag. He looked tired and angry and completely out of place in the sterile hospital room, but seeing him felt like breathing for the first time in days. He dropped his bag and was beside Lily's crib in 3 quick steps, his eyes taking in every tube and monitor with the focused intensity he usually reserved for military briefings. "How is she?" he asked, gently touching Lily's hand. "The doctors say she'll be fine, no permanent damage. But Marcus, she almost died. If we'd been even 20 minutes late getting to the hospital." He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Marcus had faced down enemy combatants and terrorist threats without blinking, but the thought of losing his daughter had shaken him to his core. "Where is Rachel now?" "County jail. She was denied bail because they consider her a flight risk." Marcus nodded grimly. "Good." Dad cleared his throat. "Marcus, I know how angry you must be, but Rachel is still family. She's sick, and she needs help, not just punishment." Marcus turned to face his father-in-law, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone used to making life-and-death decisions. "Dr. Hartwell, with all due respect, Rachel ceased to be family the moment she decided to use my daughter as a test subject for her psychological problems. I don't care if she's sick, lonely, or jealous. She poisoned a 6-month-old baby with stolen drugs because she wanted to feel important. That's not mental illness. That's criminal negligence. The room went quiet. I'd never heard Marcus speak that harshly about anyone, let alone someone he'd considered a sister for the past 5 years. "So what happens now?" I asked. Marcus sat down on the edge of my chair and took my hand. "Now we take care of our daughter, we testify at Rachel's trial, and we figure out how to rebuild our lives without someone in them who thinks drugging babies is an acceptable way to solve problems." It sounded so simple when he said it like that, but I knew the reality would be much more complicated. Because despite everything Rachel had done, despite the betrayal and the danger and the lies, part of me still loved the sister I thought I'd known. And that was going to make moving forward much harder than Marcus's military pragmatism wanted to acknowledge. 3 weeks after Lily came home from the hospital, I was finally starting to believe she would be okay. The pediatric neurologist had cleared her, saying there were no signs of cognitive damage from the propofol exposure. She was eating normally, sleeping through the night, and hitting all her developmental milestones. But while my daughter was healing, everything else in our lives was falling apart. Marcus had taken emergency leave that would run out in 10 days, and we both knew returning to his deployment was impossible. The Pentagon had been surprisingly understanding, offering him a stateside assignment that would keep him home for the remainder of his tour. But accepting it meant giving up the promotion he'd been working toward for 3 years, and essentially admitting that his family situation had compromised his military effectiveness. "It's not just about the promotion," he explained as we sat on our back patio after putting Lily down for the night. "If I take the stateside assignment, it goes in my service record that I couldn't complete a deployment due to personal issues. That follows you forever in the military. But if you go back to Europe, you'll miss Lily's entire first year." "I know, that's what makes this so impossible." Marcus stared out at our neighbor's fence, his jaw tight with frustration. "Rachel didn't just hurt Lily. She sabotaged my career and our financial security. The promotion comes with a significant pay increase that we were counting on for Lily's college fund." It was true. We'd planned our entire financial future around Marcus's advancement through the ranks. Without the promotion, we'd have to reconsider everything from our mortgage to Lily's future education. Rachel's moment of jealous desperation had created ripple effects that would impact our family for decades. The next morning brought news that made everything worse. Dad called to tell me that Rachel had fired her public defender and hired a private attorney, one of the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in Arizona. "How is she paying for that?" I asked. "She's in jail, her bank accounts are frozen, and she lost her job." Apparently, she had assets we didn't know about. Investment accounts, a trust fund from Mom's side of the family that none of us knew existed. The lawyer's fees alone are going to cost her over $200,000. The revelation that Rachel had been hiding significant wealth while claiming to struggle with loneliness and purposelessness added another layer of deception to an already incomprehensible situation. She hadn't just lied about the propofol, she'd lied about her entire financial situation. "There's more," Dad continued. "Her attorney is planning to argue that Rachel suffers from severe depression and that her actions were the result of a mental health crisis, not criminal intent. They're going to try for a reduced sentence based on psychological impairment." After she confessed to stealing drugs for months? After she admitted she calculated the dosage deliberately? Her lawyer thinks he can frame it as a cry for help rather than premeditated assault. He's bringing in psychiatric experts who specialize in healthcare worker burnout and depression. I felt sick. Rachel was going to use her mental health as an excuse for poisoning my baby, turning herself into the victim of a system that had failed to recognize her suffering. It was manipulation on a level one hadn't thought she was capable of. The worst part was that it might work. Mental health defenses were increasingly common in cases involving medical professionals who committed crimes in healthcare settings. If Rachel could convince a jury that she'd been driven to desperate actions by untreated depression and professional stress, she might get the sympathy she'd been seeking all along. That afternoon, Rachel's attorney called our house directly. Marcus answered, and I could hear his side of the conversation growing increasingly heated. "Absolutely not," he said. "We're not interested in any kind of plea bargain that involves my wife speaking on Rachel's behalf. No, I don't care what kind of character witness testimony you think would be helpful. Because she poisoned our daughter, counselor. That's not a character flaw. It's a felony. After he hung up, Marcus told me that Rachel's defense team wanted me to testify about her previous relationship with Lily and our family. They wanted me to describe her as a loving aunt who had made a terrible mistake while trying to help, not a calculating criminal who had endangered a child. They actually suggested I talk about my postpartum depression, I said, incredulous. They want to argue that Rachel was responding to a family mental health crisis and that her actions, while misguided, came from a place of genuine concern over my dead body. But the legal maneuvering was just beginning. Over the next week, we learned that Rachel's attorney had hired private investigators to look into our marriage, my mental health history, and Marcus's military record. They were building a defense that would paint Rachel as a concerned family member who had watched me spiral into depression while my husband was deployed, and who had taken desperate action to prevent what she perceived as a larger family crisis. The investigators had already contacted my OBGYN, trying to get records of my postpartum depression diagnosis. They'd spoken to neighbors about Marcus's frequent absences due to military duties. They'd even reached out to Lily's pediatrician, asking questions about my parenting decisions and whether I'd seemed overwhelmed or unstable during appointments. "This is unbelievable," I told Marcus after we received notice that our medical records were being subpoenaed. "She's turning our entire private life into evidence for her defense." "It gets worse," Marcus said, handing me a document his military attorney had forwarded. "Rachel's team is arguing that my deployment created an unstable home environment that put both you and Lily at risk. They're claiming her intervention was necessary to prevent potential neglect or abuse." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Rachel wasn't just claiming mental illness as a defense. She was arguing that drugging Lily had been an act of protection, that I was such an unfit mother, that medicating my baby without consent was justified. They're going to put our entire marriage on trial, I realized. Every argument we've ever had, every time I've struggled with motherhood, every moment of stress from your military career, it's all going to be used to make Rachel look like a hero. Dad called that evening with the most devastating news yet. "The hospital board has completed their investigation," he said, his voice hollow. "They're recommending that I be stripped of my emeritus status and that my name be removed from the cardiac surgery wing." The cardiac surgery wing at Phoenix General had been named the Hartwell Center for Cardiac Excellence 3 years ago, in recognition of Dad's contributions to the field and his leadership at the hospital. Having his name removed would be the ultimate professional humiliation, a public declaration that his legacy had been tainted by Rachel's actions. "But you did nothing wrong," I protested. "I supervised Rachel for 5 years. I recommended her for positions, vouched for her character, and failed to identify signs of serious psychological instability and criminal behavior. The board considers that a failure of leadership that reflects on my judgment and competence. So Rachel destroys her own life and takes yours down with her?" Apparently so. That night, as Marcus and I lay in bed listening to Lily babble happily in her crib, I realized that Rachel had achieved something even more devastating than she'd probably intended. She hadn't just put Lily in danger. She'd systematically destroyed every relationship and institution that our family had built over decades. Dad's medical career was in ruins. Marcus faced an impossible choice between his family and his military advancement. Our financial security was compromised. Our privacy had been invaded by investigators. And I was going to have to testify in court about the most traumatic experience of my life, while Rachel's attorneys tried to convince a jury that she'd been the real victim all along. "Do you think she planned all of this?" I asked Marcus in the darkness. "What do you mean?" "The destruction. Not just poisoning Lily, but everything that's happened since. Do you think she knew that one bottle of drugged apple juice would demolish our entire family?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. I think she was so focused on making herself feel important that she never considered the consequences for anyone else. But whether it was planned or not doesn't matter. The damage is done. He was right. Rachel's moment of jealous desperation had set off a chain reaction that was still destroying everything we'd built. And the worst part was that she was going to use that destruction as evidence that she'd been right to intervene in our lives. Tomorrow, I will have to meet with the prosecutor to prepare for my testimony. I would have to relive the most terrifying night of my life in front of strangers who would judge every word, every emotion, every decision I'd made as a mother. And somewhere in a jail cell across town, Rachel was probably convinced that she was still the victim in this story. The trial began on a cold Tuesday morning in November, exactly 4 months after Dad's retirement party. Lily was now 10 months old, babbling and crawling, and showing no signs of the trauma she'd endured. But sitting in that courthouse, watching Rachel walk in, wearing a conservative navy suit, with her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable, I felt like I was reliving that nightmare all over again. Rachel's transformation was startling. The confident, accomplished physician I'd known my entire life had been replaced by someone who looked fragile and remorseful. Her attorney had clearly coached her well. She kept her eyes downcast, dabbed at tears with tissues, and projected an image of someone who was deeply sorry for her mistakes. The prosecution painted a clear picture of premeditated assault. They presented evidence of Rachel's systematic drug theft, her calculated dosage of propofol based on Lily's weight, and her deliberate concealment of her actions. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh was methodical and relentless, building a case that showed Rachel as a manipulative criminal who had endangered a child to satisfy her own psychological needs. But Rachel's defense attorney, David Chen, was everything we'd feared he would be. He transformed the courtroom into an examination of our entire family's dysfunction, arguing that Rachel had been driven to desperate action by watching me deteriorate under the pressure of single motherhood while Marcus pursued his military ambitions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Chen said during his opening statement, "this is not a story about a criminal who set out to harm a child. This is a story about a woman who watched her sister struggling with severe postpartum depression, isolated and overwhelmed while her husband prioritized his career over his family's well-being. Dr. Rachel Hartwell made a terrible error in judgment, but it came from a place of love and desperation, not malice." The first week of testimony was devastating. Chen called witnesses who painted me as an unstable mother, who had refused help and rejected medical treatment for my depression. He brought in experts who testified about the dangers of untreated postpartum mental illness and the impact of military deployment on family stability. Marcus's commanding officer was forced to testify about the demands of military service and the sacrifices families make for their country. Chen used that testimony to suggest that Rachel had been responding to a crisis that Marcus and I had been too stubborn or prideful to acknowledge. But the most painful moment came when they called Dr. Morrison, my psychiatrist, to testify about my mental state in the months leading up to the incident. Despite patient confidentiality protections, Chen had found ways to get information about my treatment into the record. "Dr. Morrison, in your professional opinion, was Sarah displaying signs of severe psychological distress in the months before this incident?" Mrs. Hartwell was dealing with normal adjustment challenges related to new motherhood and her husband's deployment, Dr. Morrison replied carefully. "But you prescribed antidepressants, did you not?" "Yes." "Which she refused to take?" "That's correct." "And you documented concerns about her ability to cope with the stresses of single parenting?" Dr. Morrison hesitated. "I documented that she was struggling, yes, but that's completely normal for new mothers, especially those whose partners are deployed." Chen had succeeded in making me sound like a woman on the verge of a breakdown who had stubbornly refused help. When it was my turn to testify, I felt like I was defending not just what had happened to Lily, but my entire identity as a mother. "Mrs. Caldwell," Chen said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you were so exhausted and overwhelmed on the night of your father's retirement party that you barely noticed what your sister was giving your daughter?" "I was tired, but I was completely aware of what was happening. Rachel told me it was apple juice." "But you didn't question her medical judgment, did you? Even though you'd been so protective of your daughter that you wouldn't let anyone else feed her?" "I trusted my sister. She's a doctor." "A doctor who was watching you struggle every day. A doctor who was concerned enough about your mental state to take action." "She poisoned my baby." "That's not a concern. That's assault. Or it's the desperate act of someone who loves you and was afraid you were heading toward a complete breakdown." The exchange went on for hours. Chen systematically tried to reframe every aspect of what had happened, turning Rachel's betrayal into an act of misguided love and my trauma into evidence of pre-existing mental instability. When Rachel finally took the stand in her own defense, she was the picture of remorse and vulnerability. She cried as she described watching me struggle with motherhood. She talked about her own loneliness and depression, painting herself as someone who had acted out of desperation rather than malice. "I know what I did was wrong," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I violated Sarah's trust and put Lily in danger. But I was watching my sister fall apart, and I thought if I could just give her one night of rest, she might be able to start healing. I never meant to hurt anyone." But then District Attorney Walsh stood up for cross-examination, and everything changed. "Dr. Hartwell, you testified that you were concerned about your sister's mental health. Is that why you stole propofol from the hospital pharmacy?" Yes, partly. "And the other 30 patients you gave unauthorized medication to over the past 2 years, were you concerned about their family's mental health too?" Rachel's composure cracked slightly. "That's different." "How is it different? You've admitted to systematically stealing controlled substances and administering them without proper authorization or documentation. Was that also motivated by love and concern?" "I was trying to help patients who were suffering. Without their consent, without their doctor's knowledge, without regard for potential drug interactions or contraindications." Walsh pulled out a thick file. "Let me read you some names, Dr. Hartwell. Eleanor Patterson, age 73, who received unauthorized propofol during a routine colonoscopy and went into cardiac arrest. James Mitchell, age 45, who experienced respiratory depression after you decided his prescribed sedation wasn't enough. Maria Santos, age 62, who—" "Stop," Rachel whispered. "These are all patients you treated without authorization, Dr. Hartwell. Patients who experienced serious complications because you decided you knew better than their attending physicians. Were those acts of love too?" The courtroom was silent as Rachel broke down completely. The careful image her attorney had constructed crumbled as the full scope of her reckless behavior was laid bare. She hadn't just endangered Lily. She'd been putting vulnerable patients at risk for years, playing God with people's lives because she needed to feel important. "I was trying to help," she sobbed. "You were trying to feel powerful," Walsh said coldly. "And when your sister's normal struggles with new motherhood gave you another opportunity to play savior, you took it, regardless of the risk to a 6-month-old baby." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. They found Rachel guilty on all charges: aggravated assault, child endangerment, theft of controlled substances, and multiple counts of practicing medicine without proper authorization. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8. As the bailiff led Rachel away, she looked back at me one last time. There was no more pretense, no more manipulation, just the hollow expression of someone who had destroyed everything she'd ever worked for in pursuit of a feeling she could never quite capture. Outside the courthouse, Marcus put his arm around me as reporters shouted questions we didn't answer. Dad was already in his car, driving away from the scene of his professional destruction. The Hartwell name, once synonymous with medical excellence in Phoenix, would now be remembered for scandal and betrayal. 6 months later, Marcus accepted the stateside assignment, giving up his promotion but keeping our family together. Dad moved to Florida to be near Mom, starting over at 70, in a state where nobody knew his name or his story. The cardiac surgery wing at Phoenix General was quietly renamed. Lily is 2 years old now, a happy, healthy toddler who loves books and music and has no memory of the night her aunt tried to destroy her life. Sometimes I watch her playing and wonder what kind of person Rachel might have become if she'd been able to find meaning and purpose, without needing to control and manipulate everyone around her. We never visit her in prison, we never write letters or accept her phone calls. Some betrayals are so fundamental that they can't be forgiven, no matter how much someone claims they were motivated by love. But late at night, when I'm checking on Lily while she sleeps, I sometimes think about that moment in the hospital when Rachel looked at me with relief in her eyes after confessing what she'd done. I think she was relieved, not just because the truth was finally out, but because she'd finally found a way to be the center of our family's story. She'd wanted to matter, to be needed, to be the person everyone turned to in a crisis. And in the most twisted way imaginable, she'd succeeded. Her actions had become the defining event of our lives, the thing that shaped every decision we made afterward. Rachel had gotten exactly what she'd always wanted. She'd just destroyed everything else in the process. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.